Good morning. So this is a video for me to share some of my go-to responses to critiques and challenges to anti-racism work. So comments like all lives matter or white privilege doesn't exist. And I'm sharing this because I'm getting more and more critiques and challenges to my performative allyship piece. And what I do when I receive a critical comment is, well, first of all, if it's a troll or abuse, I just ignore it. But if it's not, I will take it away and I'll write it down in my little book, and I will first of all see if there's anything I can learn from it. Can I deepen my understanding? And if not, I will write down a response. So if I was sitting opposite this person and I was trying to explain to them why all lives matter is not a useful thing to say at this time, what would I say? And so I want to share this with all of you so that you can start to build up a set of responses when you're engaging in dialogue about race in your communities, so in your workplaces and in your friends and with your family. And it's really important to frame this that you, especially if you are a Black person, are under no obligation to respond to these comments. You know, you can just ignore or you can direct people to Google. But if you do want to engage in dialogue, then hopefully me sharing this is useful to start giving you a set of responses and a way to articulate the things that you might already be thinking. So, okay, let's go. So the first most common critique that I'm receiving is about white privilege. And it normally goes something like, don't talk to me about white privilege. You know, I'm on a 0-hour contract. I grew up in a working class family. I have it way less well off than someone like Oprah or Beyonce. White privilege doesn't exist. And my response to this is, when we talk about white privilege, we're not saying that every white person has it better off than every Black person or person of colour. What we're saying is that we live in a system that is built on white superiority. And that means that you may experience lots of other disadvantages related to your socioeconomic status or your gender identity or your sexuality, and we should not ignore those. But in the context of race, if you live in the so-called Western world, you're not going to be experiencing disadvantages because of the colour of your skin. And you're certainly not going to be experiencing systemic disadvantages because of the colour of your skin. So we're not saying, or I wouldn't be saying, you as a white person have it better off than me because you're white and I'm Black. What I would be saying is that you may in many ways have it worse off, but you won't be experiencing discrimination because of the colour of your skin in the way that I will. So if we want to talk about race, we have to understand that there is white privilege, but that doesn't mean that in every case white people are better off, overall more privileged than Black people and people of colour. And then a follow-up to that question may be, well, give me some everyday examples of white privilege. And my response would first of all be to direct that person to Peggy McIntosh, who is a white academic's work on unpacking the invisible knapsack. And then I would also maybe give some examples from that. So I might say, well, everyday white privilege looks like this. When I'm told about our nation's heritage or civilization, I'm shown that people of colour, my colour, made it what it is. If a cop pulls me over, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. I can easily buy dolls, toys, and children's magazines featuring people of my race. I can choose flesh colour, blemish cover, plasters, or tights that more or less match my skin. I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their daily protection. Second critique that I receive very frequently is all lives matter. So in response to someone saying Black Lives Matter, someone will say all lives matter. And a really useful comparison that I've seen to this flying around the internet is, imagine you're at a funeral and a parent has given a eulogy for their child and said, my child's life mattered. And then someone grabs the mic and says, but all children's life matter. That is literally how inappropriate it is to say all lives matter back to Black Lives Matter when Black people are being shot in the street, and that's where the dialogue is. And the misunderstanding that I think is happening is that when people are hearing Black Lives Matter, some people are hearing Black Lives Matter and then a silent more at the end. So Black Lives Matter more. But what we're actually saying is that Black Lives Matter with a silent also at the end. So Black Lives Matter also. And the reason that we have to say this is because in recent history and in current days, Black lives have not mattered. I mean, current situation, police brutality, Black people being killed by police. Recent history, I mean, in slavery, Black lives literally did not matter. They were seen as less than human, and Black people were seen as property legally. Colonization, you know, white people from the UK, for example, were going to Africa and seeing Black people as savages, less than human, who needed to be civilized. Eugenics, as late as the earliest 20th century, people believed in this practice of eugenics, which was meant to be about improving the genetic quality of humanity, but in practice was about eliminating parts of the human race, largely Black people and people of colour, by practices like enforced sterilization. So African American women couldn't have children. So yes, of course, we want all lives matter, but the reason we're having to say Black Lives Matter is because at the moment, inbuilt into our political systems, our social systems, recently our legal systems, they don't. The third critique that I hear quite often is I refuse to feel guilty for the colour of my skin. So this would be a white person saying, I refuse to feel guilty for the colour of my skin, or I refuse to feel guilty for what white people did in the past. And this is a really interesting one to go back to. And the way I would respond is to say this: great, no one's asking you to feel guilty. The English dictionary defines feeling guilty as feeling of worry or unhappiness because you've done something wrong. And maybe on some personal surface level, I speak for myself, I kind of want white people to feel a bit guilty for racism. But the much deeper part of me and the deeper core here is not concerned about you as a white person feeling guilty. What we're concerned about is accountability. So accountability is defined as the fact of being responsible for what you do and to give reason for it. And that's what's being called for here. You know, if you, as a white person, are devastated by what's happening in the US, if you deplore racism, then the ask is to locate your personal responsibility in the system that allows for racism, to see your privilege, to seek out ways to redistribute it, to do something, to be personally responsible for a system that you benefit from. So really, no one's interested in you feeling guilty. You don't have to feel guilty. What we're interested in is personal accountability for what is happening. And then the fourth critique that I got this morning is, what about the Africans who sold slaves to white colonizers? So at the beginning of the slave trade, there were Africans who were selling slaves, slave merchants. And this is really an important thing to speak on, because we have to move away from this idea of racism being about good people and bad people. So the person who was saying that was saying, well, Africans sold slaves, so shouldn't their descendants be feeling guilty? You know, aren't they bad people? And racism is not about good or bad people. There are probably good or bad people of all races, definitely. And that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about with racism is a system, an institution that favours white lives over Black lives and people of colour. It's about a system that's built on white superiority. So we look at facts, the fact that unemployment rate is much higher for Black people, that the criminal justice system at every stage is more punitive on Black people than it is on white people, despite there being roughly equal numbers of crime, that expulsion rates are higher, that wealth is lower, that COVID is higher. I mean, there are so many examples that point to a system that is set up for Black people and people of colour to fail. So the response here is no, the descendants of Africans who sold slaves shouldn't be feeling guilty, in the same way that we're not asking white descendants of slave owners to feel guilty. What we're asking people to do is to look at this system and to change it together. And again, you can really, really speak to recent history here. So very, very recently, discrimination was actually built into our laws. So as late as 1965, there was still legal discrimination through segregation in the States. In the UK, until 2015, the UK government was still paying back the descendants of slave owners for the loss of property when slavery was abolished and the property slaves were lost. So again, it's not about guilt. It's about personal accountability. And it's not about good Black people and bad white people. It's about a system where one set of people loses at the privilege of another set of people. So I really hope that this is a useful set of responses and tools for you to take away when you engage in dialogue about race in your own communities. And again, really important to reiterate here that you are not obliged to respond to these comments, especially if you're a Black person and especially at this time. But if you want to be in dialogue, then this might be a place to start. And if you are a white person who's seeking to be an ally and you can engage in dialogue, then please do. When someone says all lives matter, don't turn the other cheek. Engage, explain why that is not the point here. When someone talks about white privilege not existing, engage and explain why it does. So yeah, I hope that's helpful and thank you for listening.